Well, I'm here with photographer extraordinaire, if you don't mind me saying that, Tim Flach, who is, well, I don't really know what to call you in terms of the type of photographer you are, because you are an animal photographer. So whether are you a wildlife photographer? I tell you what, Tim, you explain.
Well, I wouldn't really consider myself a wildlife photographer because I don't tend to sit in trees waiting for some rare cat to come by on weeks. Rather that, I see myself as an animal photographer who wants to see how animals question who we are and how we relate and shape nature.
So I came across your work quite a few years ago now, quite extraordinary stuff, because you are taking these animals and often photographing them in a studio environment. So it's very different, as you say, from a wildlife photographer. You know, tell me some of the animals that you've actually photographed in this studio environment.
Yeah, quite often. Just to clarify, I sometimes do animals in location, but quite often I'm more interested in having a kind of neutral background, taking them out of their context. The sort of models I've had are often pandas, gorillas, but sometimes I take the studio to the animal because it would be inappropriate. And on other occasions, it might be that the animal comes to my studio.
So what sort of animals have you shot out on location when it's not been the right thing to bring them into a studio?
Well, such as pandas. Pretty much a whole menagerie of animals. I guess the cockroach is more easy to fit in the studio than maybe the elephant.
But surely you have done an elephant in a studio, haven't you?
I have actually, yes, but not in my studio. It's not big enough.
Oh, okay. So you had to hire a really large studio for that one, then.
Seriously, with the right entry.
Okay, so you're talking later, I know, and I believe that your talk is actually sponsored. It's by Photo Voice, is that right?
Yeah, Photo Voice is a charity that wants to use photography so that no one's denied a voice.
Okay.
Through the medium of photography.
Brilliant.
Particularly in disadvantaged communities.
Okay, and they have a stand here, so people, if you're interested, go and find out about Photo Voice.
Absolutely.
Okay, now, what are you actually going to be talking about? What's this thing that you're going to be revealing to all these really eager photographers?
Well, it will be a run through the body of my work. I've called it Who's Upside Down, Us or the Bats? Many of my pictures are about evoking questions about who we are and how we shape nature.
So, okay, so that's quite a deep, meaningful approach to the work that you're doing, isn't it? I think that's the thing about you. You are a very thoughtful, if I might say, photographer who tries to produce something different. I don't know of anybody else who is producing work like yours. I mean, do you think you're on your own in this particular genre?
I think the area of nature, I think we're seeing an emergence of many people who want to evoke questions which I think inevitably, sadly, are the prominent debates of how we're impacting nature. So I suspect we all have our different ways of approaching it.
Okay, and amongst all these animals that you have photographed, whether on location or in studio, do you have a favourite? Do you have an animal that you think is more photogenic or more interesting, perhaps than necessarily photogenic, more interesting to shoot than any other?
Well, Andrew, I think that's a good question. Because you often get asked, what's the animal you most want to photograph? But sometimes it can be one that's not very attractive. Say, in my case, I'd probably say the featherless chicken.
The featherless
prancing
chicken.
Across like some ballerina with no feathers. And I like that because it evokes questions. And I think that sometimes photography is about drawing you, engaging you. And what I often do is use aesthetics to hook people and then hopefully take them to either to the sounds or the story or whatever it is that they relate to.
Okay, and I know you've done a number of books. I have Equus actually on my at home on my bookcase. So, but you've done Equus, which is horses, obviously, all sorts of different horses from all around the world.
Yes, that was my first book, and what I want to do is to show the heritage of the horse. But then I progressed to do something with dogs called Dogs Gods, which looked very much more about shaping the animals, and more recently, More Than Human, which includes a more eclectic aspect of both animals and debates around how we manage them.
Wow, okay. And are you working on anything, a book at the moment, or any particular projects right now?
I'm about to sign a contract and start the ball rolling on a project that's called Endangered. And what it'll do, it'll actually try and use aesthetics to hook the key prominent debates around the very challenging one, which is how we're impacting effectively you might argue, our endangerment by the way that we're impacting nature.
So, are you going to be travelling for that? Is this something that's going to take you around the world again?
Well, obviously it's not clever to do a rather large carbon print, but I'd like to be strategic enough that I can do the right projects that kind of represent the key areas, whether they're climate change, whether they're invasive species, whether a story on chytrid, or just the challenge of conservation and of habitats, just to try and produce something that is a good introduction, that is both not overwhelming, but hopefully gives hope and draws you to the challenges ahead of us.
Okay, and I'm just fascinated by this idea of having these large and sometimes quite maybe potentially dangerous animals in a studio. You can't predict what's going to happen or how they're going to behave, and is that part of what you're trying to capture, the unpredictableness of it?
I think that raises a general question about photography as a medium, that sometimes, I think it was Picasso that said that he doesn't seek, he finds. That idea that sometimes things have to reveal themselves. I always believe that there's a limitation in our ability of reasoning. So sometimes the photographer's role is to be very present, to in a sense be like listening in a visual sense to what is there. And so that is something I think is important as any type of you might say, organizer of experiences, be it photographer or whatever, that you have a sense of presence in that moment and that you, in a sense, have a curiosity around it.
No, absolutely. And I'm guessing you work with quite a big team when you're doing this?
On occasion, a big team might be relevant, but quite often I try to reduce it down to what's appropriate. And sometimes it may just be me, animal, and maybe one other person who knows the animal well.
And are you working with lots of different zoos, or is there one particular zoo that you do a lot of your work with?
On my last projects, I worked everything from Durrell to Port Lynn, from various aquariums, and sometimes I work with people who manage animals in the film world as well. So it's not just, and sometimes my images may appear to be in a studio, but they're actually through glass, maybe through of a gorilla, say at Port Lynn.
Okay, so when you're working at a zoo, what kind of equipment are you actually using? What's your camera of choice?
Generally, I like to have my images blown up large. So I choose Hasselblad where it's appropriate. But if I'm doing some small pupa or chrysalis, then the optics determine that I use a different format. I generally use Hasselblad, broncolor for my lighting, because quite often I like to fragment that moment and like the advantages of speed that broncolor offer me.
Okay, and that's interesting, obviously, because I know that you, as you say, you're lighting the animals. Do they ever have a reaction to any of the lighting situations that you have them in, or that generally they're fairly calm and happy?
I think that we always assume flash is probably one of the big factors. It's usually if someone's walking around them like a pack of wolves surrounding them. It's about being sensitive to the animal behavior, and if it's a domestic animal, how the owner and the stress levels of the owner can impact the animal. So I would say you just got to be interested in that particular animal and that species, whatever, and to, in a sense, be able to monitor what the potential outcome of the shoot could be. Now, that seems contradictory to the idea of that sense of not just looking, but seeing, and that idea that you should observe. But in a way, you need the right framework.
No, absolutely, and I'm just fascinated by the idea of a young Tim Flach, age 10. Did you imagine that any point as you were growing up that this would be your career path?
I think that I knew that I wasn't very good with words, particularly written, and that probably it would be visual. But like all of us, none of us can imagine using an iPad 10 years ago. None of us can imagine the internet growing up. So, in a sense, we're all in that journey of not knowing the potentiality of the future. But I just certainly thought I might be painting something rather than photographing it, probably at age 10.
Okay, so there's always been that creative urge anyway.
A visual sense, yes.
Cool, good stuff. Okay, well look, Tim, it's been absolutely fascinating listening to you. I know everybody, you will absolutely love Tim's work if you haven't seen it already. What time is your talk? 4 o'clock, is that about right today?
I'm on at 4, whatever is it called, the super stage?
I think it's super stage.
That sounds
about
rather
right.
grand.
It does. Well, it is grand. It's grand for a photographer who works on a grand scale. So, Tim, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you, Andrew.